Welcome to Wonderland, ladies and gentlemen. This is JJ Hatter speaking. Now, some of you watching and listening will be familiar with my many lists and countdowns on DeviantArt. Among the many subjects I have covered over the years, one of the most prominent is Lewis Carroll's masterpiece, Alice's Adventures in Wonderland, along with its sequel, Through the Looking Glass. Ever since I was a kid, I always loved the Alice stories. They were so strange, so silly, absolutely bonkers, but also had a sort of dark and unsettling edge to them, which made them all the more fascinating. As I grew older, my love for the books actually grew rather than diminished, and I thus began to amass a collection of Wonderland-related stuff, for lack of a better word. I have read dozens of books, seen dozens of screen takes, played or at least become familiar with several video games. I even have a small number of toys, not to mention posters and other collectibles. The list goes on. Naturally, when you collect such a vast array of anything, you want to share your knowledge and your passion with others. The problem is there's no one in my personal life to share it all with, and I have so much I could say, I don't know where to start. I've gone off and on about the best way to do this for years, and I finally decided to test the waters with a series of internet reviews on some of my favorite, and perhaps in the future some of my least favorite, takes on the Alice tales. This coming July 4th will not only be American Independence Day, but also International Alice in Wonderland Day. So to test the waters, so to speak, I will be releasing a new review each week from now to that date, each one covering a noteworthy screen adaptation or reimagining of the stories. I was initially going to call this series 6 Weeks in Wonderland, but if I enjoy doing this, or if people respond to it well, or both, I'll probably do more, covering other interpretations and types of media outlets. But we'll see about that when the time comes. With that said, turn on your projectors and follow me down the rabbit hole. JJ Hatter welcomes you to Analysis in Wonderland. Now, with one film's exception, I will be covering these first 6 in chronological order. We'll get to the exception in due time. Today's topic, the 1933 Paramount film. Paramount's 1933 movie adaptation entitled Alice in Wonderland was not the first ever made, nor even the first sound picture. There have been 3 silent film attempts made in 1903, 1910, and 1915, respectively, along with a low-budget talkie film made only 2 years earlier in 1931. Also, one should note Disney's silent Alice comedies, which, while not directly based on the books, were very clearly inspired by them. What makes the 1933 Paramount production so prominent is a combination of 2 elements. First, the aftermath of its release, which we will get to in a little while, and second, the fact it was the first big-budget extravaganza made of the stories. It was the first to feature popular actors and artists for the time all gadding about as Carroll's classic characters as gleefully as their dignities and paychecks would allow. With the exception of young Charlotte Henry, who plays Alice herself, the cast is entirely made up of either major stars for the time, or at least noteworthy character actors. Among some of the most notable names in the movie are W.C. Fields, Gary Cooper, Edward Everett Horton, Billy Barty, Edna May Oliver, May Robson, and an uncredited Ethel Griffiths as Miss Simpson, Alice's governess. At one point, Bing Crosby, of all people, was to play the Mock Turtle, which frankly would have been amazing. In fact, some sources mistakenly still list Crosby as the performer. However, for one reason or another, the role was instead given to the equally unlikely Cary Grant. Paramount even commissioned the then well-known Harmonizing Animation Studio to create a cartoon sequence for The Walrus and the Carpenter. As we will see throughout this series, this sort of spectacularizing of the stories, throwing all your money and major stars into the blend, is a trend that has continued all the way into the modern day. The movie is a pretty straightforward adaptation of the books in terms of plot, and I do say books rather than just book, because as many adaptations tend to do and did before, it actually mixes elements of both Alice's adventures and Through the Looking Glass to form its narrative. Preview releases set the film at what was, for the time, a very lengthy hour and a half. It's worth pointing out that the film was made in direct response to the recent centennial of Lewis Carroll, and Alice Hargreaves, née Liddell, who had once been the young lady to inspire Carroll to write the stories, actually got to see the film in a private screening in its preview format. She purportedly enjoyed it. However, following a scathing review by Variety that declared the film was much too long and slow-paced, the picture was severely cut down to just 77 minutes. Whether this had any effect on its quality is up to debate. This is where we get into the aftermath. Unfortunately, I couldn't find out how much the movie actually cost to make, but as you can imagine, it cost an absolute fortune, especially considering it was created in the Depression era. Upon its full theatrical release, it was a bomb of epic proportions. Not only did it flop at the box office, but critics completely steamrolled the film. It was considered so bad that many noteworthy critics of the time honestly questioned if a successful fantasy film could ever truly be made. This was despite some successful silent films, and the critics would soon be proven wrong on that front later that decade. First with Disney's Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs, and then with MGM's Wizard of Oz. Some have suggested that the critical backlash this movie received may have inspired the creation of the other two. If that is the case, in its backwards kind of way, it is responsible for the creation of two of the most important movies ever. Irony abounds. As a result of this, the film remained in virtual obscurity for years, aside from a small number of television re-releases, until 2010, when Universal Studios released a fully remastered, crystal-clear DVD edition of the feature, in response to the release of Tim Burton's Alice in Wonderland. So, now that you know the sad history of this monochrome train wreck, how does it hold up? Is it just as bad today as it was back then, or was it unappreciated in its own time? Well, that's difficult to answer. I cannot in all good conscience say the film is completely good, but it's not completely bad either. It's very inconsistent. The script is undeniably problematic. Again, this was a blend of both books into one story, and while most adaptations are able to do this more or less organically, this one seems to have a problem there. For example, the movie basically starts off the way through the Looking Glass does. But once through the Looking Glass, and after interacting with some of the chessmen, only then does Alice see the White Rabbit and follow him down the rabbit hole. So, apparently there's a Wonderland inside the Wonderland. Feel free to insert the Inception theme here. We then followed the first book's story very closely, only to very abruptly cut from Alice and the Griffin to her running with the Red Queen, at which point we follow through the Looking Glass again. By the time you get back to Looking Glass Land, you've forgotten it exists, and by the time the Adventures characters pop up for the finale, you've practically forgotten them too. It does follow the Carroll book very closely in terms of dialogue and storytelling approach, even down to the fact there's not much point to all of this insanity. But it honestly feels like two films or stories sort of wrestling with each other. As for the rest of the movie, it's the very definition of a mixed bag. Some of the actors and performers are doing a good job and having fun, others are not. Some of the costumes and sets are very fine facsimiles of the Tenniel illustrations, others are not. Some of the songs and poems from Carroll's stories are managed well and made rather catchy, others are not. Some of the effects, especially for the time, are absolutely marvelous, others are not. I can honestly say I see why audiences at the time would have been a little cold towards the film, because it is sort of all over the place, in terms of its tone and quality. But I can also honestly say that there are some things in it that are not only done well, but some of the best I've seen in any adaptation. To make matters worse, or perhaps better, even the moments that are good and bad are not always easy to define. Probably the best example I can give of this problem is the sequence with Tweedledee and Tweedledum. This scene is a microcosm of the film, both in terms of what is right and what is wrong. The Tweedles are played by Roscoe Carnes and Jack Oakey. While their acting is over the top, it's quite enjoyable. Wonderland isn't exactly a realm for subtlety anyway. Both are clearly putting a lot of effort into what they're doing and seem to be having a good time. The aforementioned Walrus and the Carpenter sequence that is mingled into this one is one of my favorite takes on the scene and poem. For the 1930s, the animation there is quite sophisticated, and Oakey and Carnes, who narrate the poem and voice the characters, are very illustrative, bouncy, and fun to listen to. But the designs of the costumes are just plain awful. Their heads look like mashed potatoes. The fat suits are extremely unconvincing, and it's very clearly an uncomfortable arraignment altogether. The set also looks rather spooky. This is fitting for the moment where the monstrous crow comes in to frighten them all near the end, but up to that point it just gives the whole sequence a very odd and uncomfortable feeling. The music is light and merry and whimsical, and the actors are trying to play the Tweedles off as a funny pair of childish goofballs. The whole thing just lends an air of disquiet that I don't think was ever intentional. The result is a tonally dissonant scene that, while fun to watch, is also a little perplexing, and not in the way it should be. Several other sequences are similarly flawed or face other kinds of problems all their own, making the movie rather hard to get a grasp on. If there is one consistent element in the whole package, it is Charlotte Henry's performance. Initially, Ida Lupino was considered for the role of Alice, and according to at least one source, Alice Hargreaves herself approved of this choice. However, Henry was ultimately cast instead, given the facts that she was not only younger, but looked more the part. Really looked more the part. Her uncanny resemblance to the Tenniel illustrated character was actually part of the promotional press at the time. Despite the film being bashed by critics, Henry actually received a lot of praise for her work, and it's easy to see why. While there is a decided 30s-ness to her vocal and physical mannerisms, she nonetheless makes for a very solid anchor for the picture and is fittingly charming, curious, and yet also mischievous, and even has a bit of a stern edge to her in a couple of scenes. It's a pity that following this production, her career actually diminished, as, while she would play many supporting roles, she was never again, at least to my knowledge, cast in the lead part of any movie. I suspect the abysmal failure of this production overall led to that tragedy. So, we come to the conclusion. At the end of each of these videos, I will provide a rating for the film on a scale of 1 to 10. Because Alice is a very character-driven piece in general, I will be providing a top 6 of my favorite characters' performances from each picture in each review. I say top 6 because top 5 would have been next to impossible to make. As far as the 1933 film by Paramount goes, I give it what I like to call the Hatter's average, a 6 out of 10. The film has historical significance and is a must-see if you are an Alice fan, and there's enough fun stuff in it to keep avid Carollians engaged. But unfortunately, I suspect serious cinemaphiles or casual viewers will find it to be inconsistent and dated. If you look past the flaws, it's a charming if confused adaptation, but those same flaws are undeniable. Top 6 performances and characters. Ford Sterling is the White King, easily the best take on the White King ever put to film. I just wish there was more of him. Roscoe Carnes and Jack Oakey as Tweedledee and Tweedledum. Despite the terrible costumes, they are a treat to watch, and their scene is one I revisit constantly. Ned Sparks is the Caterpillar. The costume and makeup are great, one of my favorite designs for the character in film. His sharp-tongued delivery is different from most other caterpillars and against the type described in the book, but nevertheless enjoyable to watch. Charlotte Henry is Alice, an excellent focal point and one of my favorite people to play the character to date. Cary Grant is the Mock Turtle, completely hammy and very unexpected given Grant's reputation, but that's part of what makes it so delightful. Plus, nobody has quite captured the sorrow of this character quite like this. And Edna May Oliver is the Red Queen, not to be confused with the Queen of Hearts. This is basically the character brought to life in my opinion. The costume, the performance, everything about her is picture perfect. Next time, Disney's 1951 animated classic, Alice in Wonderland.